Etienne Basso. I'm the director of the Members Research Service at the EPRS. I would like to welcome you all, the speakers, but also the attendees for this EPRS event. And I would like to do a particular welcome to our two MEPs, Sven Miska and Mrs. Hannah Neumann. Welcome to both of you and thanks for being with us. EPRS has organized several book talks, but this is the third event that we organize since we have restarted business here after the confinement. And this one is on a very topical issue towards strategic autonomy in European security and defense and the EU role in promoting peace in today's world. Since 2016, in particular, the need to rethink the EU's global position and role has become apparent. Crises have not stopped accumulating and have even culminated with a global pandemic, which in many cases accelerated existing security threats. The volatile geopolitical environment surrounding Europe has led EU leaders to recognize the need for the EU to be able to act autonomously. In the EU's view, strategic autonomy means becoming more responsible for its own security, while at the same time continuing to be the strongest promoter of multilateralism. Strategic autonomy touches on many aspects from digital to health, but our focus today is its security and defense dimension. So today, during this event, we invite you to reflect about how the EU's ambition for strategic autonomy relates to its role as a peace promoter and a peacekeeper. To do this, we have a brilliant line of speakers joining us today. And I would like to open the discussion to give the floor to Mr. Miska, Sven Miska. He's Vice Chair of the EP Delegation for Relations with the Nato Parliamentary Assembly. He's member of the Foreign Affairs and Security and Defense Policy, the subcommittee SEDE, but you currently serve, Mr. Miska, as a rapporteur for the annual report on the implementation of common security and defense policy. So please, Mr. Miska, you have the floor to share with us a few words of introduction.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually mixer. I know it's confusing because it should be, for it to be read, mixer should be probably written with an X rather than K and S, but anyway, it's mixer. But thank you very much for the invitation to express my views during this online event. Indeed, the issue of EU strategic autonomy has been very high on the agenda of the European Parliament and especially its Security and Defense Subcommittee during the first year and a bit of this term. Indeed, we spent many hours last autumn while discussing last year's CSDP implementation report on the notion of strategic autonomy, and we left with the conclusion that there is no agreed definition of the concept just as yet. It's still under evolution. And as you said, the concept can be approached in a very broad manner by including economic aspects and environmental aspects and energy security and all the broad range of hybrid security issues under that definition. But it can also be approached in a much narrower sense, in a much narrower way. And when we are talking about the military security and defense, then the strategic autonomy, the term strategic autonomy is usually used in order to refer to the ability of a country or an organization, or in this case, the European Union, to launch and sustain operations without the critical enablers being provided by third parties or external partners. And indeed, when we assess whether we have the ability to launch and sustain operations without enablers being put forward by third countries or third parties, then obviously we should first come to the notion of shared threat assessment that should define our capability requirements, and that should also define our level of ambition. And from there on, we get to the critical capability requirements, which we need in order to meet these ambitions and these and tackle these threats. And obviously, defense. Military defense in particular in the European Union remains very much a national policy rather than one that is very, very highly and deeply coordinated on the European level. And that means that the capabilities that we collectively need to tackle the common threats and to meet our common level of ambition, they need to be provided predominantly by the member states. Obviously, there is the issue of producing the critical amount of mainstream capabilities. There's also the issue of investing sufficiently in research and development and in the industrial base. The European Union has, over the past several years, established various formats and structures and mechanisms in order to pool the scarce resources in order to meet the capability requirements, and also has established forms of cooperation between individual member states or groups of member states in order to address the existing capability gaps. The first question, obviously, is does the threat picture and the expressed ambition level require us to be collectively capable of launching sustained military, full-fledged military missions for our self-defense or for overseas engagements? And so far, I think the answer is that in order to meet the expressed level of ambition, not only in the narrow military sense, but also in the political realm, we do need that capability. And while when certain shortfalls and capability gaps exists, the question is whether we can, or whether in order to address or fill these gaps, whether we can simply purchase these capabilities, or do we need to create or build those capabilities on our own? And I think that the dominant answer to that question is that certain military industrial competitiveness by the European Union is actually necessary in order to be fully strategically autonomous. All our nations continue to operate on the principle of a single set of forces, which means that the vast majority of capabilities will continue to be owned and provided by member states. But capability development, especially in the areas where the gaps and shortfalls exist, is best done in very close cooperation and in very close coordination. And therefore, I think it's critically important that during the next MFF period, also projects such as the European Defence Fund, which is there to address, first of all, the R&D and industrial competitiveness issues, is fully adequately financed. That initiatives such as permanent structured cooperation, which is there to address particularly the existing capability gaps in very precise capability areas, is fully and adequately financed. And also, in order to sum up, the EU cooperation with other like-minded nations and organizations, and first of all, the North Atlantic Organization, NATO, is of paramount importance, not least because there is a very significant overlap in membership, particularly on the European continent, between those two organizations. The issue of unnecessary duplication has been raised for many years, but by now I do believe that most of our defense experts and policymakers agree that indeed in most areas where capability gaps exist, NATO and the North Atlantic security in general would also benefit from greater European investment and from greater European capability. Obviously, EU's ambition, as I said, is much broader than just military, that of a military actor. The EU wants to be an actor for peace and stability globally. I believe that for conflict resolution, and as was said before, the conflicts are still there in our immediate neighborhood as well as further afield. And for conflict resolution, obviously, an ability to run military operation is critical, but for conflict prevention, soft and smart power is equally essential. Diplomatic capability and development cooperation, and for the reduction of tensions and building of confidence on the global scene, cooperation with other countries and institutions is of crucial importance, and strengthening of the global rules-based international order, as well as progress in disarmament and non-proliferation of critical importance. I would stop my introductory bit here, and I'm very much looking forward to other interlocutors to take it over from me. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Mixer. And I should have said in my introduction that you served in your own country as Foreign Minister and Minister for Defense. And many thanks for sharing with us your thoughts about the issue, but also insights in the upcoming report on CSDP. I turn now to Mrs. Hannah Neumann, who's been joining the Parliament last year in 2019. And Mrs. Neumann, you are chair of the Delegation for Relations with the Arabian Peninsula, vice chair of the Human Rights Committee, and you are a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Security and Defense Policy. So, and you have been, I think, rapporteur on arms export. So please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Etienne. And I also want to like to thank Sven for his introduction. And you may not see much of a difference between what Sven and I are going to say, but I will take it a bit from a different angle. The term strategic autonomy has, well, gained some prominence, especially in the Brussels bubble discussions, but I think there are more versions of what strategic autonomy means than we have member states at the moment. And I think that is also part of the problem. Because with this term and the ambiguity of the term, I see three main problems coming. For me, the first main problem is that strategic autonomy, so being able to act autonomously, is a means but not an end. And we are not very clear at the moment amongst EU member states of the end towards which we want to have this mean of acting autonomously. And of course, it's important that we find ways to come together in terms of like producing capabilities. But the question of what capabilities do we need, which ones do we remain on the national levels, and which one do we want to build together on the European level, kind of has to come from the end. So where do we want to go? And we have clearly seen that the global strategy did not provide the kind of guidance that rallies all member states behind it, so that the HRVP in a given context would know what to do, and then get the support automatically from member states on that one, which would be kind of the end goal of, for me, of a European Union foreign policy that can act autonomously and independently. So I have some hope, at least there's the attempt with a strategic compass to rally member states, but to get member states to discuss this issue and maybe come towards an end. It still has to be seen how far we can go. But I think by discussing strategic autonomy and not what our EU foreign and security policy should look like in this world as it is now, we are having, let's say, the second step before we're taking the first one. For me, the second issue is, and that is what is at the moment undermining basically every real notion of the strategic autonomy, is that member states do still not seem to be willing to give up sovereignty on foreign and security policy issues. And to be frank, as long as one member state can stop all the others from acting, the problem is not the capabilities, but the problem is this need for anonymity in the foreign and security policy. And I have to say that I find it quite frustrating that the one actor, namely France, that is promoting the notion of strategic autonomy more than any other nation, is the one that thinks, as long as it's not the French way, we're not joining. And that is undermining the concept as well. And then the third issue is, and maybe that's something that's a bit closer also to what we as the parliament can do aside of pushing on member states, is that I have the impression by having all this discussion about strategic autonomy and also anonymity in decision-making or majority decision-making, we are not really making use of what is already possible according to the treaties. So for example, we have battle groups that have never been used. We have the notion of constructive abstention when it comes to CSDP missions, which I never have been using. We have possibilities to work with majority decision-making, for example, when it comes to human rights violations, which is not being used. And we have member states that actually, instead of just battling over 1 or 2 billion more or less for the European Defence Fund, could just join their national defence budgets to do all this joint capability development. And to bring it all together, and Etienne, you mentioned that I was the rapporteur on the arms export. I think the one case where you can see all these problems coming together at the moment is Libya. So when the Foreign Affairs Council kind of charged Maas and the Germans to come up with a Berlin process and the peace negotiations, and one of the outcomes of this process that was started in February was that the European Union will support the implementation of the arms embargo. So now we have a, let's say, semi-functional at best mission in the Mediterranean, which has all these weird restrictions, like where it can go and where can it not go because of the migration. So that was Austria and others blocking it. And then they have a few airplanes, but which they can only use 2 days a week. So they cannot even fully implement this arms embargo, although all the capabilities are there. It's just the member states don't give it to that mission, right? And then the problem is that although this mission has documented violations of the arms embargo by UAE and Turkey, member states of the EU still supply UAE and Turkey with weapons that go to different sides, and UAE and Turkey again support different sides of this conflict. And then Germany is asked again to continue with the peace negotiations. And I mean, really, that is the farthest away we can be from strategic autonomy ever possible, because we cannot manage to agree on where do we actually want to go. And that's only the case of Libya, where actually the problem is pretty clear. Let's not talk about our relations with Russia and other issues that may be more tricky. So for me, I think there is a huge need in this world in insecurity to have one reliable actor, where it's clear it stands on a rule-based international order, it's trying to mediate as far as possible, well, and if it can't any longer, then we need to see where it speaks with one voice, and it has a lot of economic power and diplomatic power behind it. The European Union could be that actor. But as long as it is not because member states are not willing to give up sovereignty, as long as it's not because it cannot rally behind a common strategy, as long as it's not because it's not even using the tools it has at the moment, I really don't think that the capability discussion and whether we now have 7 or 10 billion in the European Defence Fund is the discussion that we should have. And to just take it one step further, and because I think that's the crossroads we are at the moment, we really need to decide in the capitals whether we want an EU foreign policy or whether we want to continue with the, let's say, national mess that we have at the moment. Because what is happening at the moment is basically the EU is misused as a scapegoat. So whenever there's a major crisis, it goes like, yeah, but the EU needs to solve it, but then we neither give it the resources nor we give it the go-to-go. And that is undermining all of what we in the European Parliament and elsewhere are fighting for when we use terms such as strategic autonomy, European Defence Union, or whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for putting many questions that will, I'm sure, feed the discussion later on. I would like to signal also that the attendants have the possibility to use the chat, and also the panelists to use the chat to communicate and to put questions or remarks that we as moderators, myself and later Tanya, can put it in the discussion. I turn now to Sven Biskop. Sven, you are Director for Europe in the World Programme at Egmont, Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, a think tank associated with the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You are also professor at the Ghent University, where you lecture on strategy and the foreign policies of Belgium, but also the European Union. So please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I also thought for a long time I was the only Sven dealing with CSDP, but now there seems to be two of us, so that's a welcome reinforcement. I must say that I suffer from an incurable symptom of the coronavirus, which is an aversion of online events, but your colleague Tanya Latici is very persuasive. And so you can be grateful to her that I am here, so to say. Maybe to build on the previous presentation, I think that the problem that we face in EU foreign and security policy is the culture that we have developed within the Union. And I don't mean the ominous or notorious absence of a shared strategic culture, but I mean the sort of organizational culture within the CFSP, CSDP pillar of the Union, which contrasts totally with the culture of the supranational bit of the Union, which is very legal based. One could say perhaps even a bit legalistic. And if you sign up to something, if something becomes law, if you don't then implement it, the Commission will take you to court. CFSP and CSDP is the precise opposite. For 20 years now, since the creation of ESDP, member states say time and again that that we need to pool our defense efforts, and they launch big new initiatives. Everybody applauds, everybody goes home, and then we don't do it. And so we have the same debate time and time again. I know, because already an MA student in 1998, I started to look at European defense when we still thought we were going to do it through the Western European Union. In spite of all this, I try to remain an optimist. I'm not sure. I would not agree. I think with Mrs. Neumann that the strategic autonomy discussion is not useful, because it is in a way the starting point also. The problem is, I think, that too many member states have the illusion that they have national strategic autonomy. And of course, all EU member states are sovereign and can take sovereign decisions. But in the military field, strictly by themselves, they can all take the sovereign decision not to do very much. And as long as some member states don't accept that reality, then we're not going to get anywhere. But I do agree with what you said, Ms. Neumann, that we should make better use of existing instruments, and then I would mainly refer to PESCO and the European Defence Funds. I mean, PESCO is the umpteenth attempt to pool our defence efforts, but so far, I don't think we're making really good use of it, even though it has much more potential than any previous effort. We're using PESCO like I use my smartphone. I didn't have a smartphone for a long time because I felt I didn't need one. I didn't really want one until basically my husband bought one for me, and then he explained me how to use it. Then after a few days, he came to the conclusion that having a smartphone doesn't make me a smart man. So what do I do with my smartphone? I'm old-fashioned, so I make actual telephone calls with it. And if there's free Wi-Fi, I check my emails. That's it. So I use less than 10% of the available functions, right? And that's what we're doing with PESCO. You could do so much with PESCO, but we're using PESCO as a mini EDF. We're using PESCO only to do collective procurement projects to get the EDF bonus, but only marginal projects, For the sake of the argument, I'll put it bluntly, with one or two exceptions, all of those projects, they are useful, but they're marginal. If we do all of them, the picture of European defense will not change. Whereas if you read the Council decision and the commitments, PESCO is about much more than collective procurement to then equip national forces. PESCO is about integration of forces. And I do mean integration, not cooperation, not interoperability, integration. It says we have to harmonize defense planning, we have to harmonize our equipment needs and the requirements, and we have to contribute strategically deployable force packages. That we're not going to do by just cooperating a bit more and by fiddling in the margins. We will only do that by actually integrating our forces. And that means two things for me, integration. It means, on the one hand, using national building blocks to create permanent multinational force packages on a big scale, not small scale and temporary like the battle group. Every battle group after its rotation is dissolved again, and a battle group is basically a battalion. If we don't use them, it's because they are useless for operations. There's very few operational scenarios that you could solve with just a battalion, except securing a European Council meeting, but we have the Belgian police for that. So what we need to do, if I talk land, is you use a brigade as the building block, and you anchor national brigades in permanent multinational divisions and corps, so that between all the brigades, you totally harmonize the equipment. Around the brigades, you merge all the support units, and you equip those brigades with the enablers so that they can deploy by themselves. That's integration of your combat forces. The other side of that is pooling the enablers. Instead of, collective procurement for creating 10 transport fleets and 15 drone fleets, let's keep our enablers together and operate them as European fleets, a real European air transport fleet, instead of just a European air transport command, a single European drone fleet, if the PESCO drone project would function. That's a sort of far-reaching step that I think PESCO was meant to be, but instead, the member states have allowed it to sink into procedures, procedural debates about third country participation and so on and so on and so forth. So to conclude, I do agree we also need to debate the purpose, right? We need a capability. We also need to be much more forthright about what we need them for. We have some indications in existing documents, global strategy, the implementation plan. We know we want to do crisis response in the neighborhood, the broad neighborhood. We want to do capacity building, and we need to protect Europe. But all of that needs a lot more fine-tuning, and I think that is what the strategic compass then should do, to link the practice of PESCO and the operations with the global strategy, and to say these are not only the types of the operations that we can do, that we know, but this is where we will be, this is where we want to do operations and why. And the debate is in fact taking place in a smaller club in the European Intervention Initiative that looks at specific regions, specific possible scenarios, and tries to think through in advance, if A happens in region B, what do we think is our responsibility, and what should we be able to do about it if this scenario materializes. But that will require, very difficult, very sensitive discussions. Then you're not talking about archetypes of operations, and you're saying, if state action or neighborhood were to collapse, what do we think is our responsibility? If we have that discussion in the strategic compass and we link it then to our defense planning, then I think it will be a useful exercise. If we don't link it in the end, the outcome to our defense planning, it will be another document to add to the long list of documents about which me and my academic colleagues can write even longer papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven, and thank you for focusing on PESCO and especially on the potential of PESCO. I'd like to mention in that context that the Council has started its discussion on the strategic review, and the Parliament will vote next week its recommendation on PESCO and the future of PESCO. We are going to move to the second part, namely this roundtable discussion for this event. We are now 112 online following this event, so it's a successful event. I would like also to mention, taking the advantage of being moderating, a few publications from the EPRS. First of all, the one that is specifically dedicated to PESCO ahead of the strategic review. Then I'd like also to mention a work that has been conducted by Elena Lazaro, who is with us today. It's a peace index, which we call the Normandy Index, that is mapping the threats to peace and democracy in the world. Together with this document, we have also the Peace and Security Outlook. It's a document that we issue every year, and it's a third edition of the Peace and Security Outlook. It's a very in-depth research on peace and security. And then something that we have done in the EPRS involving several colleagues, especially over the confinement, they sit down together as much as possible, and they worked on the concept of strategic autonomy in a multidisciplinary approach. And I very much encourage you to read these contribution that you find on the website of EPRS, but also on our app. And with that, I would like to hand the moderation to Tanya Latici. Tanya Latici is one of our experts in the External Policies Unit, but she's also one of the authors of the several documents that I mentioned, or she contributed to the several documents I mentioned. So up to you, Tanya, to moderate the roundtable. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Etienne. Thank you to our panelists and also to all the many people that have joined us today, decided to spend your lunch break with us, despite the ongoing coronavirus symptom of Zoom fatigue that Sven mentioned. My name is Tanya Lacic, and I work as a policy analyst on security and defense at the EPRS. And I just like to first point out how happy I am about the gender balance of this panel, first of all. We've seen that indeed the Svens of this panel are in a majority, but okay, we'll try to do better next time. So, as your moderator today, my job is to not only ensure a smooth debate, but also have the unpopular role of making sure that everybody sticks to their 5 minutes allocated, just to ensure that we have a smooth and dynamic and interactive debate. So for that, I have a timer next to me, and also you might see this slightly passive-aggressive clock coming up when it's time to wrap up and conclude. So for our audience, I definitely encourage you to already think about your questions and do ask them in the Q&A bar. Then it will go directly to the panelists, and I'll make sure that our speakers get them. So we've heard so far a lot about PESCO. Of course, the political timing is ideal. We've heard about what PESCO should do, what it shouldn't do. We've heard about strategic autonomy, what it is, how many types we have, what it isn't. So now it's up to our next cohort of speakers to give us all the answers to those questions. And I will begin with Mr. Jean-Pierre van Aubel, who is an expert on security and defense policy and strategy at the EAS. And he will give us all the scoop and the state of play on the ongoing EU defense initiatives from the EAS side and ongoing strategic reflection processes, which I'm sure our participants are very much looking forward to hearing about. And Mr. van Aubel, I understand, has to leave a bit earlier. So to our audience, I do encourage you to ask maybe already to think of the questions that you might want to ask him. So, Mr. van Aubel, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Tanya, and thanks for having me here. 5 minutes to answer all the questions is by far not enough, so but I'll try my best. Let me first start, I think, with the 3 main defense initiatives that came up already in the discussion, and it's very hard, I think, to now be a little bit more positive than the 3 introducers. And by the way, of course, I share their impatience, but perhaps also good to remind everybody that we've launched these initiatives only a few years ago. And everything obviously started with the global strategy in 2016 and the level of ambition derived from that. And only after that, we have launched permanent structured cooperation by the end of 2017, so almost 3 years ago. The coordinated annual review on defense, also not to forget, and the European Defense Fund. Now, on the 3, on PESCO first, I think I share a lot of the comments that Sven Bisschop made, and I'd actually like to refer to 2 titles of excellent pieces of work that he has written. And I think a few years ago, at the early days of PESCO, Sven said that we should give PESCO a chance. Now I think he says that we should not waste the chance. And I think that's exactly where we are. 3 years since the launch of PESCO. What is important, I think, to remind, and that is what I still see with member states, is that PESCO indeed is not only a capability development process. It is much more, or it should be much more than that. But actually here you still see a division among the member states. And I think in the ongoing PESCO strategic review that is really currently under discussion, discussions are starting today actually in the political military group on this PESCO strategic review. This is the crux. Because what we see is that the progress on the commitments, the 21 commitments that have been made by the member states in the framework of PESCO, by the 25 member states, that the progress, notably on the operational engagement commitments, is lacking. And I think that's an overall trend that we see in the European Union, and I will come back to that later. So this is something besides the capability development, because should also not forget that capability development really takes time. I always say that the development of capabilities takes at least 10 years, and it always takes longer, and it's always more expensive than from the outside. But what we can do is have a lot of quick wins on the commitments that focus on operational engagement, and notably also on the first commitment, which is a very important one, meaning that member states should continue to increase their defense budgets. Now, in the actual situation, of course, that's going to be a real challenge. So let's see how we end up with that one. PESCO strategic review is ongoing, but we're indeed at crossroads. Member states now need to be put their cards on the table and show how serious they are on all these commitments, and again, not only on the capability development one. Moving to the coordinated annual review on defense. Again, a process that has started 2 years ago, but I think a very important one. I've just seen the report. The report will be, or is actually also now under discussion with member states, will be presented and discussed ministers in November at the Foreign Affairs Council meeting. But very important here, I think, are the notions that member states need to do more to align their defense organizations. And what do we mean with that? Very simple, member states need to align their defense planning. Is this something that will happen overnight? No, it will not. This will also take time. But at least there is the notion and the recognition that member states need to do this. And I think these are very, very important steps. And only if member states are going to align their defense plannings, they can see where there are more forms for cooperation. And again, fully agree with Sven, member states have a sovereign right, but no one, not even the bigger member states, are still autonomous when it comes to military action. So they need to cooperate. But you also need to know where are the areas of cooperation. And I think by aligning the defense planning schedules, that is something that can really help member states in seeking and improving cooperation. Thirdly, European Defence Fund, obviously a very interesting instrument, I think. You can be rather negative about it and saying, yes, it was very promising, and certainly the amount was very promising, but the ultimate amount now is a bit disappointing. Cannot completely disagree with that. On the other hand, it's still an opportunity. And if member states use this opportunity now to benefit from the European Defence Fund for the first time, benefiting from the overall EU budget, then I'm sure that there will be opportunities in the future to enlarge this field. However, if member states do not benefit from it now, I'm afraid that it will be over. And I think that is a very important notion that member states really have to take into account. This on the three defense initiatives. I'm really looking to the clock, and I haven't seen your clock yet, Tanya. So I use a couple of more minutes, if you allow me.
Mr. Van Obel, excuse me to interrupt, but we have a problem with your camera.
Is it back on? Is the camera back on?
Yes.
I see a thumbs up. Okay, sorry for that. I don't know what happened. Moving to the other part, and that's the part that I actually am working on now, and I've heard it already mentioned by the three introducers, and actually they scare me a lot because I feel the burden on my shoulder growing. That is the strategic compass. And I think this is a very important step that we're working on now, obviously, and that we need to work on. So 2 minutes on that, if you allow me, because I think it's important. What we need to do with the strategic compass, indeed, is try to translate now into very concrete deliverables the EU global strategy, which I admit indeed is very general, into concrete political ambitions that can also be translated into the various planning processes. That is what currently is lacking. Institutions are recognizing that, member states are recognizing that, so that's very important. Ultimately, what we want to do with the strategic compass is build a real European strategic culture, because that's the thing that is lacking, that we all agree indeed on the same threats and how the EU should deal with those threats. That is why now we're in the process of developing a threat analysis that should be presented to ministers again at the FAC in November. So the FAC in November is quite an important one, and that should be the first step in building strategic compass. And next year we're going to work on the compass in 4 areas, and then I'll stop. First, operational engagement. How can we improve the effectiveness of our operations? And we really need to do that, and certainly also improve our force generation, because Operational engagements are lacking behind at political decisions. Secondly, how can we have the right capabilities? Thirdly, very important resilience, because if we, that I haven't heard that yet today, if we speak about strategic autonomy, it's also about protecting our vulnerability.
Okay, so I will jump in here since I see that the internet gods are not with us anymore. I want to thank Mr. Van Abel for his remarks, and I will demand payment for the extra minutes that he has spoken in the shape of some conclusions that he can share with us at some point on the strategic review, especially on the operational dimension. What are the conclusions from the strategic review on that front? Because I see that our previous speakers, and I think almost everyone is interested to seeing more meat on that particular bone. Having said that, I'm very happy to now introduce Dr. Jana Puglierin, who's coming to us now from Berlin, where she heads the Berlin office of the European Council on Foreign Affairs. And the ECFR is, of course, doing absolutely stellar work on strategic autonomy that I can assure you everyone at the EPRS is certainly reading. And I've actually read a recent piece of yours where your conclusion is that those who wish to work for a greater European sovereignty should be aware that they can only achieve this in cooperation with the United States. I hope I didn't misquote you there. So having planted this thought here, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I also like your publications a lot and I benefit from them. And so this is a great opportunity. I was asked to basically give a diagnosis of the state of European security and defense and talk a bit about the way forward. So the first thing is much easier than the second, and I start with a diagnosis and allow me to take a step back and I come back to transatlantic relations here. So the overall diagnosis I have is that, yes, we can talk about PESCO and CARD and EDF and all of this for a long time, but I think the fundamental problem here is that after a period of sincere progress, kind of after Brexit in 2016, and a lot of new energy, I think that the policy area has lost momentum completely at the moment. And I don't see that political momentum coming back soon. And I make 3 points why that is the case. First, so I can provide data evidence. ECFR does a biannual project. It's called the Coalition Explorer. We do a survey amongst the EU 27, and we ask experts and policymakers from the member states about their perceptions of each other as member states, but also we ask this one question: which policy areas should be of the highest priority for your government in the next 5 years? And I was personally so shocked to see that France is actually the only country that has put European defense first. So the EU average is rank 14 out of 20, and that's where the Germans rank it too. Only Cyprus, Greece, Hungary, and Romania have it in their top 5, and 17 member states don't have it in their top 10 priority. So on top of the list is kind of fiscal issues, migration, and climate change. And I think with rank number 7, Russia is the first foreign policy, kind of purely kind of foreign policy issue that was mentioned. So it seems to me that and we did the survey mid-March from end of April. So that was the beginning of the COVID crisis, where we kind of started to understand the magnitude of this, but not completely. And I see the EU kind of very much inward looking. I see von der Leyen, who was so much pushing this topic as a defense minister in Germany, not even mentioning it in her speech on the State of the Union. So I think, especially in Germany, I sense a lot of mission accomplished syndrome. A lot of people think, oh, we have EDF and PESCO in place, so it's all wonderful and fine, and we are there and we don't need to do more. So that was something I wanted just to share this finding with you. The second one is that I think, and that was mentioned before, that now with the COVID crisis and with the huge recession and economic crisis that our economies are facing, that will be likely to squeeze our defense budgets. There's huge pressure on national economies. And of course, theoretically, this could lead to more coordination and more kind of pressure on the Europeans to work together. I mean, that was the whole idea last time after the financial crisis has hit us, when we talked about pooling and sharing. But somehow, I'm just not very optimistic that we learn from previous experiences. And I really hope that I'm wrong here and that we did learn. But I think that we will see a lot of uncoordinated budget cuts again. And so I just don't think that, coming back to my first point, there is enough attention to consider this as a priority. So I think defense budgets will just end up under the bus. And the third point is that so EU security and defense and the progress in it has always also been largely influenced by developments in the US and transatlantic security. So I do it now. I predict a Biden presidency. I know that this is kind of toxic and we shouldn't talk about it until it is done, but I think he will win. And I see a lot of, so when I did that study that you mentioned on kind of where do the Europeans position themselves on the transatlantic relationship, I see that desperate longing of the Europeans to kind of cling to the United States and now to kind of work with the Biden administration to deepen the ties. And so there were a lot of transatlantic quarrels over strategic autonomy and EDF and PESCO and third-party participation and the US being out of this and all of this undermining NATO. So I see a Biden administration being more favorable of kind of European efforts, but the defense industrial issue and the third-party participation issue would remain difficult. And I think that many member states don't want to undermine a newly established transatlantic relationship with the Biden administration. They don't want to alienate the Biden presidency. So I think that we will hear a lot of talk about, oh, sorry, can you hear me better now? I just see it in the chat. I just think that there is a lot of emphasis on the European pillar in NATO, much more than on EU defense, and so I think it will be really hard to keep the enthusiasm for European defense. And I actually am worried that the EU member states will be split. France will go forward to strengthen kind of the European pillar, not of NATO, but the kind of the European ability to act autonomously, whereas I think that the rest will emphasize NATO again. And I think it will remain controversial. I'm done in a minute in which framework the Europeans do that. So my way forward is we need to bring the attention back and we need to emphasize that with Corona and with the Biden presidency, the problems have not gone away. I think that has not sunken in. And I think we need to discuss NATO and EU cooperation. I know that we discussed this since Sven Biskop went to university, but we really need to find a new solution here because, I mean, a Biden presidency will not be that focused on Europe. But I think, coming back to what you said that I wrote, so we need to bring the Americans on board much more than we have done with the Trump administration. I think there is an opportunity. But maybe we should reconsider how also to engage them in our efforts. And full stop, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana. I took a lot of notes, and I think you gave a lot of food for thought to our audience, which I really hope to see reflected in our Q&A. I see questions keep coming in now, and I encourage you to keep up that pace. So my main takeaway from what you said is actually that there is extreme pressure for Europeans to work together, and there's extreme pressure to spend the money that we currently have and the money that we are going to have after the coronavirus much more smartly, much more wisely. And actually at the EPRS, we also work a lot on these issues. We have a big study assessing the cost of non-Europe, where we also look at these defense issues, and we reached the same conclusion as you did. But on that note, I'd like to, last but not least, introduce my colleague and most recently boss, Elena Lazaru, who has recently become acting head of the External Policies Unit in the EPRS. But she, of course, still retains very much her expertise on security and defense and global governance issues. So, Elena, please do give us your take on what has been discussed so far, and do tell our audience how our peace and security baby contributes to this debate as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tanya. As a host for a second and not a panelist, thank you very much to everyone who is participating. I feel like a hybrid specimen here, part host, part panelist. So thank you very much to everyone who is participating, but a particular thanks to Tanya, who not only contributed greatly to organizing this, to the conceptual idea behind it, but has written some excellent work as well on an issue we haven't mentioned as much, which is really the changing nature of the military and defense itself, that COVID has really illustrated, in the sense that militaries and defense are not necessarily only about warfare these days, which is, thanks to the work of Tanya, leading me to perhaps the first point I want to make. So two conceptual macro things in 1.5 minutes, I hope, before I start getting to my points about strategic autonomy. The first is the changing nature of peace and security. And not only that this is happening right now, but there is a sense when one reads the Treaty of Lisbon, and it has been mentioned several times there, that there has been a fundamental reconception of what was included there, in the sense that, yes, the treaty said the EU's external action will be oriented towards the promotion of international peace and security. But in many ways, the treaty left many things open, and one can sense perhaps there that there was not at the time a sense of the world developing into the geopolitical environment of today. So a lot of what is CSDP, provisions on PESCO, on 42.7, are left there open to interpretation and to adaptation to what we would see happening later. And in many ways, reading the treaty, one would not have imagined that in 2016, our level of ambition would also include protecting the EU and the citizens of Europe. So largely the EU's work in promotion of peace and security was being seen as operations in Africa, operations in other theaters, capacity building and security sector reform in other countries, so what we knew as CSDP back then. So this fundamental change we've seen, which has to do, as we always say, with the way that geopolitics are changing, the multilateral order is changing, has led us, I think, to have discussions again on the basis of the Treaty of Lisbon, but really on what should be the strategic orientation of the EU in a context where the threats have changed. They're not classic military threats only. Our capabilities have changed, the member states' attitudes have changed towards security and defense. So we are really in a new environment, working with a treaty that is 10 years old, is my point. And I think that that is a lot of why we are having so many reflection processes, as a lot of procedures and processes to really refine what is in the treaty. What does it really mean moving to qualified majority voting? What does it really mean to implement PESCO? What does it really mean to do 42.7 while there's also Article 5? So I think the changing environment is really something very important. But in many ways, we, I think, are calling some old things with new names, because I also want to refer to Sven's earlier years, Sven Biskup's earlier years, because I remember very well that in 2009, Sven asked the world, does the EU need a grand strategy? And that's also over 10 years ago. And in many ways, the question we're still asking, and which Mrs. Neumann alluded to, which the strategic compass is trying to find out, which is essentially, yes, we have means, we have tools, we have cooperation, but what are the ends? That's a very old definition of doctrine, connecting means with ends. And we are still asking this question, albeit in this new, much more strategic, competitive geopolitical environment. So now strategic autonomy comes into play, but in many ways, we're asking the same thing we asked after 9/11 even, and at the end of the 2000 first decade, and same thing now. Except now strategic autonomy comes in. And one reason for that could be even the changing nature of threats, because we are seeing that you can be autonomous not only operationally or in terms of your capabilities in the military dimension, but also technologically, financially, in your participation in multilateral cooperation. So I think, yes, new things, but also old things that need to be resolved for the EU to define its identity in this area of security and defense, and more fundamentally to see how to use the entire toolkit of its peace and security basket for the promotion of peace. And here, yes, self-promotion for a second, we have done the security and peace outlook. We try to do it every year. And the idea is to look at the EU's attempt and the EU's efforts to promote peace and security, not strictly from the defense dimension, but also in the holistic manner that the treaty suggests. So using also development tools, trade tools, humanitarian aid tools, diplomacy, etc. Now, having said that, on strategic autonomy itself, I would not dare to give a new definition, but I think building on a definition that the Parliament actually gave in last year's report on the CFSP, strategic autonomy could be the ability to independently be able to do three things at least, which is to do an independent threat assessment, make decisions independently, and operationalize / act on these decisions independently, always also in cooperation with partners. And I'd like to just qualify this a bit. I've had a thought about this many times. On the threat assessment part, there's a lot of elements that can contribute to this strategic autonomy. One, of course, is actually carrying out a threat assessment exercise together, such as the strategic compass, informed by the work that is being done in many places that do research, such as the JRC and others. But there is also an element of having autonomous situational awareness, sort of being, is that 1 minute or 0? 1, great. There's also an element of being able to have the capabilities to do independent situational awareness, because that feeds into the threat assessment. And here I would say situational awareness has changed as well. So it's not just land or air, but it's also maritime situational awareness, cyber situational awareness. So we have to have developed all these tools. And the third element of threat assessment, which I think is becoming increasingly important, is foresight. So the ability to see these threats, how do they interlink with each other? What happens in scenario of sort of black swans, unprecedented events, COVID, etc. On making the decision, here it becomes very complex as strategically autonomous decision making. And I won't get into the details, but it has to do with political elements, institutional elements, QMV, the works, everything we talk about on a daily basis as people who try to work this out. And finally, and most importantly, and many have alluded to this in this discussion, yes, decision-making and threat assessment, but operationally is a very big question. Libya was mentioned, other theaters were mentioned. And here I had several points, but perhaps the most important is to operate in a way that implies strategic autonomy. A fundamental part of this is working with partners, and that is where I think the link between strategic autonomy and multilateralism becomes extremely important, because the only way to have partners to work with is to work together with them in formats that encourage the building of common values, shared norms on a variety of fields. So I will stop here on this threat assessment decision-making acting model and look forward to the Q&A. And again, thank everyone for being here.
Thank you, Elena. Again, a lot of food for thought. So audience, come on, bring it on. So we already have questions coming. But first of all, I see Mr. Van Abel is still with us. I would like to ask you a question. You know how moderators in Brussels bubble debates in particular say that they must abuse their role as a moderator. So I will try to do the same and ask you a question before you leave, because I understand you might have to hop off a bit earlier. So I wanted to connect a bit to the point that you made about the PESCO strategic review, which is currently on the table of the PMG. So I'd like to ask, how exactly is the PESCO strategic review renovating the PESCO house to better reflect the operational CSDP commitments that member states have taken, which are obviously extremely related to the EU's ambitions of strategic autonomy and one could say the most visible aspect of the EU potentially having strategic autonomy. So I'll give you a minute to think about that, if that's okay. And then I'd like to pinch Mr. Mixer and Mrs. Neumann, in particular because Mrs. Neumann is the chair of the delegation for relations with the Arabian Peninsula, and Mr. Mixer is the vice chair for the EP's delegation to the NATO PA. We received a question from Samuel Zabolotny. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. And it's about NATO, Turkey, and Libya. So the question is, do you see NATO's future threatened by Turkey's fundamental differences in foreign policy, As we've seen in Libya, French and Turkey are on different sides of the war and on legal aspects. So if you could think about that for a second. And then I would also like to give Sven Biskop a question, because I think I think it's a point that almost everyone on this panel has touched upon, which is decision making and the discussions that we currently have on qualified majority voting and unanimity in foreign policy. So Sven, if you could give us your thoughts on that, I'd be grateful. But for now, I'd like to start with Mr. Van Aubel, then with Mrs. Neumann, then with Mr. Mixer, and then with Sven Biskop. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope I won't fall away this time. Yeah, on the question on the PESCO strategic review, now there are a couple of proposals now from our side to encourage and increase the operational engagement. First of all, proposals on incentives, how to do that. Second of all, proposals to encourage the modular approach. And I think there is already actually a PESCO project, the CROC project, that could serve as a very good basis. And actually this was what Sven Biskop was also referring to in his introduction. So work more in a modular way that member states, or a small group of member states, because this doesn't necessarily have to happen at 25. This can very well happen with 5 or 6 member states who take the lead on this. But they would better integrate, is the right word indeed, their forces, do that in training, education, but also go beyond training and education, because I admit PESCO is a lot about training and education, and we need to go a step further than that. So this is all in the PESCO strategic review, but also ideas to work more in terms of rosters. One of the problems I think member states often face is that they do want to commit to an operation, but that they are afraid that they will be there endlessly because there is no certainty about who's going to follow them up. And as you know, no member states today and no Minister of Defense or Foreign Affairs still wants to be for 10 years in an area of operations. So if you can work with rosters, like is also done in the United Nations, then that could perhaps be a solution to make it more attractive for member states to participate in operations. Another aspect that we certainly have to look at is also the financing. And yes, I agree also on other aspects with Elena, who said that a lot of the questions that are currently on the table are old questions. They might be old questions for the think tankers and for people outside the forum. They are also not new to the member states, but what is new is that they're finally on the table. And also the question of strategic autonomy is something that 3 years ago, we couldn't even discuss amongst member states. And the fact that we are discussing it now does give me a little bit of hope. But back to the operations, I think also one of the items that we have put in the PESCO strategic review is to really look at how we should develop a full spectrum force package, because that is in the PESCO, the original commitments list. And that actually member states committed to work to this full spectrum force package. And if you look at it on an honest look today, then you can see that there are still critical gaps lacking there, and that the EU is not capable at this stage to fulfill its complete level of ambition. And I think these are the gaps that we need to focus on as well. So quite a lot of ideas on the table. It's now up to the member states, of course, how far they want to go. And we see quite a large group of member states who is very willing to go that far. But yeah, there is also a group of member states, to be honest, who is a bit more reluctant and who certainly also wants to see the link with NATO in this side. But on the other hand, I think, and that has been the line throughout PESCO as well, that if we reinforce these capabilities and if we reinforce the operational engagement of the European Union, then this will ultimately also be for the benefit of NATO. Let me leave it there.
Thank you. This was really comprehensive and what I was looking for. Thanks a lot. May I give the floor to Ms. Hanna Neumann?
Thank you, and I will mostly pick up on the Turkey question, if I understood that correctly, because it was addressed to me. I mean, what we see is that apparently there is a rift between the European Union and Turkey on the one side, if you look at the NATO, but also it's not very easy with the current, let's say, with the current US president when we look to the US on the other side. And I think this feeling that NATO is not the alliance that is also built on common values, which it never was supposed to be, but we thought it would be that, I think, for some time, led also to this, I think, discussion of strategic autonomy that has resurfaced in the last 2 or 3 years. Where with the US, we would have to see how it goes with the new president, but I think Jana is very right on 2 aspects. The first one is, even if Biden is coming, that doesn't mean everything will be perfect, but also there's no way to go without the US. With Turkey, things are maybe slightly different, but it's not that EU member states have already made up their mind. It's rather that we have this very mixed setting. For example, we have the European Parliament calling for an arms embargo against Turkey, and some member states actually having an arms embargo against Turkey, which is partner of our defense setup, which in itself is very contradictory, and we need to find ways to deal with it. Then we also have the situation with Greece, which also we are now seeing puts the European Union in a very difficult situation, because on the one side, the European Union is based on common values and really is a union. So we are de facto in kind of a solidarity role with Greece, whereas at the same time, we're trying to be the mediator, or people call on the EU to be a mediator between Greece and Turkey, which again will just make sure that the EU is going to fail on one of the 2 roles. And this shows that on the long run, we will have to find a way how to deal with Turkey, but NATO maybe is not the biggest problem in all of this. I mean, the question is, what do we do with the refugees, what we do with the situation in Greece? So the list is very long, and I think NATO then what will happen on that with NATO will maybe stem from that, but it's not going to be the first one.
Thank you. Mr. Mixer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to first of all say that I consider myself as an integrationist when it comes to European Union. As an Estonian social democrat, I'm very much in favor of close integration of European structures. But as a former foreign minister and former minister of defense, I would like to ever so slightly caution us against running too far ahead of the bus when it comes to integration of defense. When it comes to, for example, calls for fully integrated units beyond the battle groups level, or greater use of majority voting. And let's recall how NATO, for example, which is very much a strictly collective military defense organization and intergovernmental organization, how NATO operates and how NATO launches operations. These decisions are taken by consensus. Every single member state has a veto over the political decision to start an operation, even an out-of-area operation. And once that consensus decision is made, nothing is actually automatic. There is a forced generation process whereby member states bring assets to the table and also pay for those assets that they contribute. So if the European Union were to try to create units that are under European command and deployed by a decision by any European institution, it would go much further than NATO actually has gone. And I believe that I would also like to recall that we use the single set of forces principle, which means that we do not set aside particular units or particular capabilities for NATO purposes or EU purposes or UN purposes or national defense purposes. So it's a single set that each of our member states operates and is capable of deploying. Plus, I would like to recall that deploying forces, deploying servicemen and women to fight and potentially die abroad is very much a national sovereignty issue. I remember when the German Bundestag first took a decision to deploy forces to the Enduring Freedom Operation back in late 2001 and early 2002, and this vote was actually tied to the vote of confidence in the city government of that day. I cannot imagine Germany or any other European Union member state actually delegating the right to deploy its servicemen and women abroad to die to a sort of supranational institution, at least not anytime soon. So I would be very, very cautious here. Plus, there is a legal issue of immunities, for example, when it comes to deploying forces. But to the Turkey issue, obviously Turkey is an EU partner and EU candidate country, but it's also a NATO member state, one that actually has one of the largest militaries of the North Atlantic Alliance, one that actually hosts a significant number of US sub-strategic nuclear weapons, one that has stake in each regional conflict and has a huge stake in Black Sea and Mediterranean security. So obviously when that partner and that NATO member state is actually purchasing weapon systems from Russia, when it's actually making threatening statements against European Union member states, when it is behaving not constructively in a number of regional conflicts, I think there is a lot of reason for concern. Whether it can do anything to make NATO less functional, well, NATO, as I said, is an organization that operates on the basis of consensus. So obviously, it is in a position to make life in NATO much more difficult. I hope that it will not abuse that position. But all that being said, I think that the EU cannot afford to not have a strategy, not having a policy vis-à-vis Turkey in security and in a number of other policy areas.
Thank you, Mr. Mixer. Before giving the floor to Sven Biskop, we also received a question, kind of a follow-up to my kind of broader QMV question, which is also what decisions in foreign policy should in fact be taken by QMV. But before I give you the floor, Sven, let me ask Elena to already start thinking about another question that we received from our EPRS colleague Jan Baverstrom. Namely, what are the strategic partnerships that the EU could actually use to call upon if/when intervening in future crises in the neighborhood? And finally, I'll also give Jana already a minute to think about another question, namely, how far should the EU's strategic compass reach? As in, how far should we look in terms of defining the EU's global interests, and therefore also in terms of the potential future operations we should be thinking about? But for now, Sven Biskop, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tanya. I mean, I get this question often when I speak also for audiences of officials and military, and I recently have come to say that actually you could do QMV on everything in CFSP and CSDP. The only exception being that you could not force a member state to contribute troops to an operation. But objectively speaking, there is no reason why you could not vote by QMV on anything else. And you could even say, if you want to go further, you cannot force a state to send troops, but you could force it, if it doesn't send troops, to co-finance it. It sounds radical, but I mean, if we can supranationalize our trade, our currency, if we have to submit our national budgets, including the defense budget, to the approval of the Commission, then it's actually not such a big step as you think. And so we need to distinguish, I think, between this decision-making and the integration of the force. Because let's be honest, if we don't integrate our forces, we have 27 sets of very tiny armed forces, some of them very tiny, and even the biggest European forces are small at the global scale. I mean, France can deploy a brigade into Mali, which is a lot compared to Belgium, but at the global scale, it's of course not very much. And France can put that brigade into Mali at short notice if other member states and if the Americans help out with specific assets. So the choice is not between, doing lots of things separately or doing lots of things collectively. The choice is doing lots of things collectively or doing pretty much nothing at all, or doing it in an improvised manner. So my view is that you can go very far with integration of units while maintaining the flexibility to participate or not in a specific operation. I mean, Belgium and the Navy have basically Belgium and the Netherlands have basically merged their navies for a couple of decades now. But we still maintain the freedom of action to go our separate ways when it comes to actual operations. If we can do it, everybody can do it. Thanks.
Okay, my main takeaway is the choice is to either do things collectively or not doing anything at all. Okay, something to remember. Now I give the floor to Elena.
Thank you. And just to clarify on the point about saying these are old questions, I really didn't mean the questions were old, but I realize, and I thought I alluded to it, that the fact that they are being put on the table and answers are being developed and frameworks are being thought of and rules are being designed for the implementation of treaty articles. Of course, this is new and it's a very welcome development. I just was really alluding to the fact that the EU has been looking for its actorness in security and defense and what really that means and to what extent it is really military and defense proper or a bigger mix of things and instruments for a while, before these crises that we're seeing now have started, even before the Russian annexation of Crimea, before even the Arab Spring, before then. On the question about strategic partnerships, I mean, this is a really broad question. If we're talking about peacekeeping and really interventions where the military is involved in the traditional sense, the obvious partners are the United Nations and then the regional organizations on the ground. I'd point to the cooperation with the African Union, which is really important in that domain. And in the bigger sense, obvious strategic partners in defense is NATO. I mean, it's been made very clear here, and I think that ever since the joint declaration of 2016, the cooperation has expanded to fields that even go beyond what we would call the traditional ways in which we could envision NATO and the EU cooperating 10 years ago. So that's a very welcome step. And I think, incidentally, as NATO is looking towards its NATO 2030 reflection process, which is taking NATO a bit closer to the political, and then the EU is involved in this ongoing strategic compass process, which is taking the EU a bit more towards the defense. I think the two organizations will really work even more strategically together in the future in new domains such as terrorism and cyber and hybrid threats, but also traditional ones like maritime, which is very important. The two partnerships are also about like-mindedness. So I think increasingly, I think the United Kingdom will be a strategic partner to develop a very rich strategic partnership with in this area as soon as the rest is agreed, or while the rest is also being agreed, and obviously the United States. But I'd like to stop for a second on the UN, which was the first one I mentioned, because I think the question came from the fact that I said multilateralism and strategic partnerships are very important, because it's in that context you develop common norms and common ideas about what the goal is. And in fact, partnering is about pursuing goals in common. So the UN is really the forum where this is happening. And in this context, there are two axes. One is working towards the ongoing reform of the UN, both in peacekeeping and in development. The nexus between the two, the climate elements, the gender elements, this is all a very big part of the bet, you know, on agreeing on common ways of seeing these things. But the UN is also the forum where it's like we're seeing increasingly new issues like cyber and AI become relatively multilaterally institutionalized. So I think in that format as well, it's very important to think those partners that we work with in the context of the UN, we will form the same norms and the same ideas on autonomous weapon systems, on artificial intelligence and defense in the context of the UN. So its strategicness as a partner is becoming even more important in my mind, as long as these formats of cooperation are developing within the UN framework, which is what the EU would like to see, while of course acknowledging that, yes, stakeholders are changing and there are new formats as well of multilateralism. Thank you.
Brilliant. Jana, please give us your thoughts.
I very much like the thoughts on NATO and EU cooperation and the potential. So I keep my fingers crossed that Elena's right. So So can I say something on QMV before I come to the strategic compass? Because so I think that we have seen quite a hysterical debate about QMV, I think, in the past. So one side was or sees QMV frequently as kind of the silver bullet and the kind of one instrument or solves it all thing. And I think this is completely exaggerated. And the other half thinks QMV is kind of the incarnation of kind of the evil and the end of it all and the biggest disaster that could happen. So I think there are clear advantages when it comes to QMV, especially because then there would be much less incentive for external powers to cultivate kind of Trojan horses within the EU and to use them. But I mean, we have this emergency brake in the treaty, so a member state can object to a decision being taken by qualified majority for vital reasons of national policy. So it is not as if kind of this would be the end of the world. I think it would be a very helpful instrument, but I mean, it would be a small building block in the overall architecture. And there are downsides. I mean, small member states fear that they are outvoted by bigger member states. And I think we have to take that very seriously. I think when we talk about democratic legitimacy, which is always already kind of a problem for the European Union, kind of then QMV would actually weaken the democratic legitimacy of a decision and also the weight that the decision actually has. And we should not forget that some of the deepest rifts within the European Union date back to the migration crisis and QMV decision taken there, and kind of we have not really recovered from that. So I think QMV, I'm totally in favor personally, but I think we should not exaggerate the meaning of this and what we can achieve. It's not a silver bullet. It has downsides that we need to address, and I think overall we should aim for it. But yeah, we should keep things in proportion, because I think most issues, as far as I understood, are decided by member states through kind of soft law and what they call the open method of coordination, and that is based on consensus. And so this is kind of where the majority of decisions are taken. So on the strategic compass, so I see it as a super good exercise, and I'm very grateful that this is done. I think especially because it links kind of the German Council presidency and the French Council presidency. It's a project that both countries have embraced, and that is, I mean, in the field of European defense, they have been against each other in so many issues that I think this is kind of a healing process and something where both member states can really align. I think it injects, or it could inject, a great deal of coherence into European defense. It definitely can help to develop a common strategic culture. It should help, although in terms of timing, maybe that's not ideal, but it should help to define what capabilities the EU should develop. So I think it's a super useful tool. I see some problems though, and Sven Biskup has talked about kind of the danger that this becomes just another strategy and just another paper and has no real meaning. And I think he has a point here. But I think that the member states might be very tempted to avoid the hard questions. And to me, one of the open questions is Article 42.7 in the EU treaties and Article 5 Nato. And I mean, there, I think the French have a reason why to push this debate. And I think it's scary that some member states think even discussing kind of territorial defense in an EU framework is kind of the end of it, and we should avoid this. I think is very concerning, because I think we should openly talk about this. What role for the EU in territorial defense based on Article 42.7? Is there any? I think we should have this debate, but I, at the moment, see that kind of there is this tendency to talk more about procedures again, and kind of what role for the institutions and who would do what when, and not kind of on the really hard substance. So that's something that I think needs to be avoided. And another thing is, I was looking a bit into the resilience question, and I think I don't envy anybody who works on this right now in the strategic compass, because it's so complicated. And I mean, theoretically, you have to include so many things when it comes to resilience. And way beyond security and defense. It's about kind of critical infrastructure. It's about cyber warfare. It's about, I don't know, now with the coronavirus crisis, I think a totally new dimension has come in. But here, I think that the challenge would be to prioritize, so what to include and what to keep out, and to have this narrow lens of defense and security, but also to be aware that you cannot really, I mean, so everything nowadays is basically security and defense related and nothing. So to strike the balance here, that is the biggest challenge, I think. Full stop.
Thank you, Jana. I agree with you. I also think we should talk much more about the debate on collective defense, on all the mutual defense clauses that we have there. And if we do organize a defense debate as such, you'll be the first one on our panel, I promise. But now, because we're coming to a close, I'd like to invite all our speakers to think of their famous final words and an additional question. For our MEP guests, I would like to ask them, alongside their famous final words, if they could share with us what they think the EP expects from the strategic compass process. For our other speakers, I'd like you to answer alongside your final remarks, in one sentence, what you would like to see the EU do on security and defense in 2021. What would you like to see in one sentence? So I'll start in the order in which we spoke. So I'll begin with Mr. Mixer.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would like to thank everyone for a very, very, very good and very enlightening exchange of ideas. And I think that the one thing that we all should hope for and work for is to see that in this time of crisis, corona crisis, and economic downturn, that we do not fall to the temptation of cutting the funding for defense, both on European level as well as on national level, because I do not believe that it is possible. While it is possible, obviously, to spend the scarce resources more wisely and without wasting too much, it is not, unfortunately, going to be possible to do more with less. So I think that it's important that while we have defined the ambition and created or called into existence various forms of cooperation, that we really put the money where our mouth is.
Excellent. Mrs. Neumann, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, first I will try to answer your question with regards to the strategic compass. I really hope that the process of the strategic compass, which is not led by the European External Action Service or the Commission or the Parliament, but by the member states, really secures buy-in and ownership of the member states in this whole discussion of CSDP and CFSP, and may lead to something where we could at least decide on some strategical, let's say, goals that we join in together, and where member states would then really follow the European approach, even if it goes, well, even if it compromises a bit their purely national agenda and interests. And if we could reach that one, and I think having it started by the Germans and having it ended by the French is a very good approach to go towards this end, we really reached something, and I hope we can get there. So my famous last words. Well, Sven said a lot about putting your money where your mouth is. I also want to be us to be very cautious about where we put our mouth in the first place, to be frank, because we discussed also today a lot now about military capabilities and discuss strategic autonomy as something that has to come with working together in the military field. I don't see in the next 50 to 100 years, to be frank, no, let's say 50 years, I don't see in the next 50 years that this European Union, as the member states as it has, will be willing to face Russia or China or the US militarily on the same battlefield, nor will it have the capabilities to do that. So that's why I really think we should also continue to invest in what, for me, European Union strategic autonomy should be before all, which is diplomacy, civilian capabilities, civilian battle, well, they're not battle groups, but diplomacy groups or whatever, but on this whole array of civilian tools that made us strong and that still defines also along the treaties, by the way, and what this European Union is, and that really by starting to work together in baby steps on the military, we should not forget this whole field of foreign policy.
Brilliant. Sven Biskop, very quickly, famous final words and the answer to my question.
It's all the same, you know, just do it. PESCO, just do it. No more, no less. Read a council decision, do it. That's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Jean-Pierre van Aubel, I see you're still with us, so thank you for that. And apologies if I neglected you with my questions. I followed your instructions. So very happy that you're still with us. Looking forward to your final remarks. I can appreciate that you can't give your personal opinion. So if you could tell us what the EAS maybe is looking forward to in 2021 for European security and defense. The floor is yours.
Thanks. No, very shortly, I think in one sentence that we develop, as I said, a common strategic culture through the compass to strengthen the EU strategic autonomy. I think that's the only thing we need to do. Sounds very simple, but a lot of work to do. And I would add to that, despite whether or not Joe Biden is the next president in the United States. And I think that is the biggest challenge that somebody said, I don't know who it was today, but somebody said it, that we might have a backfall in all these initiatives if Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States, because many of the member states might think, then we're back to normal. And I don't think that we will be back to normal or back to where we were before with the United States. So it is important that we keep going on and that we develop this compass, which should help and answer all the questions that we have put on the table today, including on 42.7, and discussions are ongoing there, although I admit indeed not on the most pertinent question, perhaps collective defense. But voilà, this is what we should focus on, I think, despite who becomes the next president in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. We have plenty of topics to cover for future roundtables on defense. Jana.
Okay, then I add that I want to see a thriving transatlantic alliance with a strong European pillar and a lot of coordination between the EU and NATO, also when it comes to capabilities, the defense planning process between kind of the NATO planning process and the EU planning process closely linked, and that we kind of see not what we've seen in the last years, kind of that we were talking about EDF and PESCO as if we were opponents, but that the United States embraces this and that we kind of give the United States a place and that we do it together.
It's quite a laundry list, indeed. Elena, up to you.
A good, productive agreement with the United Kingdom on the way forward. We all know that on security and defense we will continue to cooperate, but I hope this is, stamped and sealed and that we know that we continue. And perhaps, since it will hopefully be the year when we start having a European Defence Fund, to make sure that SMEs and the social aspects of that are also included so that citizens will support this. So that's my final word too.
Brilliant. Well, I see we're a little bit over time, but so I'm very grateful to everyone that stuck with us all to the end. So I'd like to close very quickly by using a quote that I recently discovered in a book that I just finished reading, and it's "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." And I think, this is attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, who obviously spoke about this referring to America, to the United States. But I think we can also take a European perspective when looking at this quote and say that this is actually what Europe is trying to do, is trying to build the stick at the moment. We've seen this is the first time the EU has managed to get as far on defense. We've heard from all our speakers, from all of you, about the work in progress, about what we should look forward to, what are the challenges. And we've also seen that the EP cares very profoundly about all of these matters. So I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your contributions and reflections with us. They matter a lot. And to conclude, I'd like to just mention two upcoming EPRS events. On the 27th of October at lunchtime, we'll have an event about the politics of religion in Europe today. And on the 29th of October at 4 o'clock, we have an event about quite an obscure topic, not sure you've heard about it, the 2020 US presidential election. And with this, I'd like to first and foremost thank our brilliant speakers for joining us, but also the audience, which we've seen joined us in over 100 strong numbers. So thanks a lot for spending your lunch break with us. Thank you and see you next time.
Thank you, Tanya.